Hello everybody and welcome to the second video in the C++ tutorial for beginners. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the C++ program structure, kind of the flow of code in C++, so how certain lines of code are executed and in what order, and then I'm going to be talking about all of the code we wrote in the first video in depth. So with that said, let's dive into the video. So in the first video in this series, we wrote this code right here as our first C++ program. Now all this code did was just print something out to the screen that said hello world. Now what I want to do is go through this code in depth and discuss what every single line is doing and why we need it. So let's start with line number 1. Well, line number 1 says include IOStream. Now what include does is it takes a library of code and it tells our compiler that we need this for our program to run. It says all of the code that's written inside of this library, you must include it in this program right here. So when we compile this program, all of the code that's written here will be included in this compilation. So it'll be included in our executable file. And the reason we need that is so that we can access all of the code that's inside of here. So in a library, there is a ton of code. And what a library is kind of a set of features or functionality that us as programmers can have access to. So for example, this IOStream library, this stands for input output stream. This allows us to input or get input from the console or output something to the console and a few other things as well. This is what allows us to actually use this right here called cout. So cout, what it's doing is character output, right? It's outputting characters to the screen. However, this is not super simple to output something to a console. In fact, this is probably, hundreds of lines of code to actually allow this function right here to operate. Now we can take for granted that that's super complicated and we don't have to know how that actually works, but we have to understand that there's code underneath this that is actually allowing this to function. So we need to include all of that code in this file right here. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to use this cout. So hopefully that's kind of making sense, but the idea is there's all these built-in features in C++. All of these things that the C++ developers have done for us, for example, allow us to output stuff to the console, and for us to be able to use that, we need to take all of the code that they wrote and include it in our program. And we do that by using this include statement. So whenever you want to do or use some specific functionality, if it's not by default built into C++, you need to include it in your program, and usually you do this at the very top. That is why we have this include line, and that's really all you need to understand about libraries. They are a collection of things that we as programmers can use that the C++ developers have written for us, and you can also import other libraries that other people have written that do stuff for you, right? That is the idea. All right, so now let's move on to line number 2. It says using namespace std. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated, so I'm going to skip through a fair amount of this explanation just to really not confuse any beginners or intimidate everyone. But inside of this IOStream library, there's something called a namespace, or there's actually multiple namespaces. Now, a namespace is just a collection of code. It's just a way to divide code up into, kind of what it's doing, into specific areas, so that code that's related to one thing is going to be in one namespace, code that's related to another thing is in another namespace. So in this example, there is this namespace called std, which stands for standard. So inside of IOStream, there is a namespace defined called std, and inside of that namespace are all these functions like cout. So console out, characters out. And then there's another one called cin, which stands for characters in. So that is what's defined inside of the namespace std. Now, if we don't use this namespace std, we still have access to the namespace because we've included it in our program. We've included all of the code written in the IOStream library. And inside of the IOStream library, there's the namespace std. However, if we want to use this cout thing right here, well, we don't know where that is. It's defined inside of a namespace. So for us to be able to use cout, we either have to explicitly reference what namespace cout is defined inside of. In this case, we would write std, ::cout. And what this means is inside of the IOStream library, find the namespace called std, and then find the function called cout and use that. That's kind of what this line means. You don't have to understand this. I'm not trying to confuse anyone, but the idea is that if we don't include this line right here, we don't know all of the stuff defined in std, or if I write cout, I don't know where to look for cout. So as soon as I include this std, so I say using namespace std, What that now means is that everything defined inside of std, and I'm trying to get my C out written here, everything defined inside this namespace, I can now access without having to reference std before it. So as soon as I do this, anything inside of here, now I can access and use without writing std : C out. Because now we've looked at all of this stuff inside of here and we've used it inside of this program. So hopefully that kind of is making sense. If it doesn't make sense, you can totally just take for granted that we're writing this line, and we'll discuss it later on when we actually get into defining our own namespaces. But for now, understand it's allowing us to access all of the things inside of this namespace without explicitly referencing. If we don't use this, it doesn't mean we can't access it. It just means that we now need to write std : because we have to say where cout is defined. Whereas when we have using, we are now telling the program that we want to use all of the stuff inside of std, so we can use it without having to explicitly reference it. Those are the first 2 lines, definitely the most complicated ones that I had to explain. So sorry for the abrupt cut here, but I realized that I missed something pretty important, which is the line terminator, or the semicolon that we see here in this program. Now, whenever you're writing C++ code, you're usually going to need a semicolon at the end of the line. There's a few exceptions, as you'll see throughout the series. For example, at the end of the function, you don't need a semicolon, although adding one is totally fine. It's not going to mess anything up with your program. But at the end of any statement you write, or any command, if you want to call it that, you need a terminator or a semicolon. Now, the reason you need this is because the compiler reads kind of lines of code one at a time. So what I mean by this is we would say this is one line of code, we'd say this is another line of code. Now, if I forget this terminator, what's going to happen is even if these 2 things are on separate lines, the compiler is going to read them like this. It's going to squish them both together because there's no terminator between this return and between this cout. So that's going to cause an error. The compiler is not going to know what to do with this because this here is not a valid command. You can't write this. This isn't valid. But now when you add this semicolon, this is valid because now you have 2 separate commands that will be interpreted as such, interpreted as 2 commands, and then they can both be executed in the correct order. So this one first and this one after. Now you don't need to have this return statement on the next line. Obviously, it's way easier to read, and I'm going to do this in the tutorial, and this is good practice to have all of your commands or statements, whatever you want to call them, on separate lines. However, you don't need to. You can do this. This is totally fine. In fact, even when we're looking at a function like this is fine as well. This function will still execute. There will be no problem with this because C++ can still read all of this code because we have the proper line terminators and we have the closing and opening parentheses. So just keep that in mind. That is why we have the semicolon. And now let's resume the video. Now let's talk about this line right here, line 4. So line 4 defines something called a function. A function is just kind of a block of code, and you can run a function and you can run it multiple times. Now we will discuss functions in depth later on, but the idea is code that's inside of these curly braces is a part of this function. So when this function runs or executes, all of the code inside of it is going to run, and the code runs in sequential order. So just like line 1 runs first, then line 2 runs first. As soon as I call the main function, the first line inside of the main function runs, then the second line, and so on and so forth. And code works just as, like reading a book would. We read down, or from top to bottom, and from left to right. So that is the idea. So this function right here, though, is a little bit of a special function, and this is what's called the entry point of our C++ program. So in every single C++ program, there is one, we'll call it a function because I've kind of described what that is, that needs to be run immediately as soon as the program is run. So we kind of need to tell C++ what code we want to run as soon as we, press enter in the console and run our compiled program. And in this case, that code that we want to run immediately must go inside of this main function. So in every single C++ program, we must define in the following format: int space main. We then have our 2 parentheses, then we have our open curly brace and our closing curly brace, and anything inside of here is code that will run immediately when our program is executed. So we must have a main function. So we will continue in 1 second, but I need to quickly thank the sponsor of this video and this series, which is AlgoExpert. AlgoExpert is the best platform to use when preparing for your software engineering coding interviews. They have mock interviews, data structures crash course, over 140 coding interview practice questions, just a ton of high quality resources. So with that said, check out AlgoExpert from the link in the description and use the code TechWithTim for a discount on the platform. Let me show you what happens if I don't define a main function in my program, or I call this something like main start. So if I do this and I go now and compile my program, so g++ -o run program tutorial2.cpp, notice that we get an error. Now this error is very cryptic, it's hard to read, but it says over here, undefined reference to win main at 60. What this cryptic line is telling us is we don't have a main function. We couldn't find a reference to the main function. We need a main function. If we don't have a main function, we can't run our C++ program. We don't know where to start. So now if we go and we define our main function, as you know, this is going to work. So there we go, that works. And if we run program now, this works as we would expect. So you need a main function. Anything inside of here runs immediately. So from now on, for the rest of this tutorial, all of the code that we write needs to go inside of this main function. And later on, we will discuss how you make other functions and how you get other code to run from this main function. But for the next few videos, just imagine all the code you write must go inside of here because it's going to be executed as soon as the program is run. All right, hopefully this is kind of making sense, but this is the entry point of our C++ program. All right, let's talk about this return line. So whenever you define a function, and again, we'll get into functions later on, you define the type that this function is going to return. We haven't talked about types yet, so I won't talk about this too much, but pretty much functions must return a value that is the same type that is defined that they're going to return. So if we say this function is going to return an int, which stands for an integer, we must return an integer. So in this case, we return 0 because 0 is an integer. And we're just kind of, satisfying C++ rules and saying we're just going to return 0 to make sure we don't get an error. Now, if you worked in other programming languages, this probably makes a ton of sense. If you've never coded before, you can somewhat ignore what I'm saying. I'm just explaining kind of why we need this return 0. Now, in this case, in this main function, we actually don't need this. The reason we don't need this is because this main function is the entry point of our program, and C++ kind of just knows that this one can be treated a little bit differently. We don't need this return statement. But in other functions we write, we will need this. And again, I don't want to get into this too much because I really don't want to confuse you guys. If it doesn't make sense, ignore what I just said. If it makes sense, great. But that's why we have this return line. This is just good practice to have in our main function. All right, so now let's talk about cout. So cout, as we saw, it takes some text and it outputs this to the console. Now, cout again stands for characters output. This right here is what's called the stream insertion operator. You don't need to remember that name. You don't even really need to know exactly what it does. But whenever you use cout, you then add the stream insertion operator, and then anything after that that you would like to insert into the stream. The stream is just the console, the text that's going to be outputted to the console. Now, it turns out that you can insert multiple things to the console. So you don't, or to the stream. You don't just have to insert one thing right here. You can insert multiple. And to do that, you would write the stream insertion operator again, and then you would write whatever else you would like to insert. So in this case, let's put Tim. So now if I compile this, so let's compile this program and let's run it. We see that we get hello world and that we get Tim with no space. So that is how we add multiple things to the stream. Now let's see what happens if we use cout a second time. So now I don't want to just output one line. I want to output multiple lines of text, right? And ideally, let's change this to like Joe or something. We want this line to run first and then this line. So let's just run this and see what we get. So g++ -o run program tutorial2 run program. Now notice we get hello world exclamation point Tim, hello world exclamation point Joe. But look, these were not on a separate line. Now intuitively, you would think that these would just go on two separate lines, right? The reason they don't go on two separate lines is because cout is just accessing the console and it's just shooting characters onto the console, and we need to tell cout to go to the next line. So to go to the next line, we need to use something called an escape character. Now, whenever you're actually working in any like Word document or console or anything where you're writing text, there's these little invisible characters called escape characters. Now, they are defined by a backslash and then some character or sequence of characters that kind of tell the console what to do with this. So \n is what I believe is called the carriage return. And whenever you press enter, what you're really doing is you're inserting an invisible \n into the console that kind of tells the console to go down to the next line. Now, that's a little bit of a lie, but you can kind of think of it that way. So when I have this \n, this tells my console to go to the next line. So if I add my \n here at the end of this cout, what you will see is after the cout, the console will go to the next line, and then it will print this line right here. So let me just show you that. So if I do this, g++ run program and run program.exe, we see that the next line shows up afterwards, right? Because we added this carriage return, this \n. So let's add another one. And let's see what happens when we have two \n's, just for experimental purposes. So we will compile and oops, let's go here. We will now run and notice we get hello world, blank line, and then hello world again, because we went down 2 lines. So that is \n. That is how you get down to the next line. Now there's some more escape characters that we can use, and escape characters is anything that starts with a \. I won't get into them right now, but you're welcome to look them up and you can kind of mess with them in the console and see exactly what they do. But that's the idea behind \n. Now it turns out that there's another way to do this. There's a little bit cleaner that doesn't require us to use a \n. Now I might mess this up because I forget exactly what it is, but I believe it's called endl. Now, endl is just a nicer, cleaner way to read something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this endl to my stream. So I'm going to insert it after Tim. And what this is going to do is now tell cout to go to the next line. Endl is really just an escape character. It's really \n. It's just kind of hiding that it's \n. So that if you're reading this, it's easier to understand. This means go to the next line. So now when I add endl to the end of my stream here, and I go ahead and compile my program. So let's just clear the screen to give us some space. Let's compile, let's run. Notice it goes to the next line. And I could add another endl. So I would do this and then endl like that. And now let's see what happens if we go to the next line. So now we go 2 lines, right? So that's the idea behind cout. So let me zoom out here so you can see everything. That is endl, that is the escape characters. And honestly, I think that's all I really needed to discuss in this video. So let me just quickly recap some of this stuff. As you can see, we're reading line by line. We start in this main function, right? And then we read the first line in the main function, the second line in the main function, the third line in the main function, and so on and so forth. Now, cout does not automatically print something on another line. So you need to make sure you're explicitly saying if you want to go to the next line by using that \n or that endl that I just discussed right here. Now we'll talk about why some of this is in strings, why some of this is not in strings. And when I say strings, sorry, I'm talking about quotation marks. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in the next video. But yeah, that's all I really need to discuss in this video. So with that said, hopefully this is clear. Hopefully this gave you an idea of how a C++ program actually works. And the key takeaway here is that this main function is the entry point of our C++ program, and that we need to include functionality that we're going to be using in our C++ program, because by default, it is not all here. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in another YouTube video.